Is your favorite plant considered a weed in its local environment, or is it even an invasive species in other environments around the world? Stick with me and let's dive into the topic. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. Now, for today's video, I thought let's dive into a topic that maybe a lot of people don't realize, and it is the topic of a lot of the houseplants that we have all got and truly love in our conditions might be considered either a weed in their own natural environment or even an invasive species if they're introduced into different environments. So let's have a think about what might be considered a weed. A weed is generally a plant in people's gardens or out in the environment where people don't want it to be growing where it is growing. It's not considered visually appealing, all of these things. And it's usually, and this is the key point that I think everybody needs to take away from this, is a weed is usually a plant that is tenacious. It will grow even in really, really bad conditions. And it just has that willingness to keep on keeping on. How many of us, at least I can talk to the people here in the UK because I've been dealing with weeds at the allotment for the longest period of time. How many of us have been pulling out stinging nettles, dock leaves, all of these things, and some even more kind of tenacious plants from our gardens, only for them to come back a bit later, especially if you're not going to use anything like pesticides. So yeah, not pesticides? Weed control chemicals, basically, not pesticides. I don't know what they're called. I think it's weed control chemicals. Spray things, basically, that kill off the plant, but potentially leach chemicals into the soil. Not a good thing. So that is what a weed might be considered, basically. The other thing would be what's an invasive species. So let me give you a couple of examples, and that might make a bit more sense as to what an invasive species might be. So is it duckweed is one thing that's almost considered a bit of an invasive species because it will grow on waterways and it will multiply really, really quickly, block those waterways, possibly stifle out the light going down to other plant life or animal life that's happening below the water surface, and it then causes issues. And a lot of the times, invasive species tend to be species of plants or animals. I think an animal can be an invasive species as well, where they don't have natural predators in a specific location, but that location is optimal for their growth. So normally where they grow naturally, it would be the conditions which would be favorable to that plant, but it might have natural predators. So the level of growth of these plants or animals is controlled. I'll give you a couple of examples, at least as far as I'm aware from here in the UK. So one of those things might be, I think, is the munkjack deers, and I'm going down the animal route now. And if I'm not mistaken, I might be wrong, do tell me if I'm talking rubbish in the comments down below. I think munkjack deers are native to the Far East and potentially Japan. They're very small deers, basically. And if I'm not mistaken, again, this might be hearsay, this is what I've heard over the years, is that they were in zoos or kind of places where people can go and look at the animals, and some of them escaped out. And since then, the UK has not been able to control the numbers of these munkjack deers because guess what? They don't have natural predators here. So a lot of people that live further out in the country in the UK will know a lot of times if it's wooded areas, you need to be careful of deers crossing in the middle of the night. I don't even know what the deers might be called, the ones that are native to the UK, but deers that are not native here, just because they are prolific in their growth and reproduction. So loads of baby deers coming out, basically. Same thing goes for plants. One of the ones that I can think of that's a kind of vivid example that I know from people that I was speaking to in Australia is, if I'm not mistaken, this might have changed. Do let me know if you're from Australia and this has changed. Opuntia, or the prickly pear cactus, is illegal to bring into Australia and possibly grow. I'm not sure about the growing if it's illegal, basically, because Australia, at least I think a large chunk of Australia, is ideal conditions for prickly pears. It's now an invasive species. It grows like a weed. And it's interesting because I don't think prickly pears is something that grows quite prolifically in Greece. It's almost considered a bit of a weed. I don't think it's considered invasive, but I can imagine how it would be an invasive species somewhere like Australia, because the climate can be quite similar at times, basically. So, and I do know from a lot of people in Australia, when they were trying to get really interesting kind of opuntias or prickly pear cacti into the country for collections of succulent collections, it's very difficult. So, but this is what I mean. It can become quite badly invasive, basically. So let's have a look at a few plants that are either considered weeds. I think most of these are considered invasive species. And let's dive into a bit more about where they might be considered invasive species. So based on the research that I've been doing, one of the plants that might surprise some people, maybe not actually, that is considered invasive in certain parts of the world is the humble spider plant. I'd say it may not surprise some people, because if you've ever grown a spider plant and you see that it sends out those stolons with the little baby plantlets on the ends that will also end up starting to grow roots, and you can imagine if it gets really heavy and it drops down, as a new baby spider plant there to do this, to grow up and do exactly the same thing and prolifically grow. And if there isn't kind of natural predation for this species, you can imagine if it grows quite rapidly, it will start encroaching on territories of native plants potentially, and basically being a thug and not letting those grow, because it can grow quite happily around those kind of habitats without having anything to kind of chomp away at it and kind of reduce its numbers every so often. So some of the parts of the world that it is considered invasive, based on what I could see, are places like New Zealand, Hawaii, and some sections of the States. I think Florida and possibly California are the ones that would really kind of be those locations where this plant could be invasive. And it kind of makes sense if you think about the climates of all of these different areas that I've talked about. They can be quite similar, basically. Coming into another one that I can talk from personal experience with this one, the English ivy. Most definitely, I think in people's eyes, at least in the UK, especially if you've ever had it growing in your garden and you did not put it there, it's a weed, basically. It really is. And invasive, possibly, I guess. It depends on how you look at it. Is it a weed? Is it invasive? Is it both? Probably a bit of both, basically. It is one of those things that will grow like wildfire. And it's not even in really obvious places. You'd think with a name like English ivy that obviously in the UK it would grow a lot. But I've seen ivy growing at an alarming rate even in places like Greece, where I was from. And the climate is very different between those two nations. So it is quite a vigorous grower. And you can kind of see the pattern emerging here when you see fast growers or plants that can easily propagate themselves, like we were talking about before with the spider plant. This is what starts becoming an issue. And anybody who has seen ivy growing in gardens, growing in the wild, can easily see how this plant could also be considered invasive, because it will cover whole buildings. It will cover trees. When I first moved into the house that I bought here, there was ivy growing up an entire trunk of multiple trees, basically, and had covered that entire trunk. And I'm sure at some point it would have started pulling down some of that plant if it had reached the top, obviously. I did deal with it, so it's no longer causing any real issue to that plant, but it does grow quite rapidly. And it's something that I've always said as well, specifically about the English ivy. I truthfully don't think it's the best houseplant. It can be really tricky to grow. Its watering requirements I found are very exacting, and it can get spider mites super easily. Growing it outside for a lot of kind of climates, as long as you're not freezing for most part of the year, is generally going to be the easiest place you can grow it. However, think once, twice, 3 times before you consider putting this in the ground. But even in the pot, we'll talk about what you can do to kind of avoid some of these plants becoming invasive in just a bit. So this plant, as I mentioned, could be considered a weed or invasive for a large chunk of most of the states, and it is considered a bit of a weed for a large chunk of Europe as well. So take that and understand with it what you can, basically. There is a really interesting one that I think was the Hedera helix, which is a scientific name for the English ivy, the Hedera helix erecta, I think it is. And that's an interesting one. If you've ever seen, you probably would have never have seen this. It doesn't come up very often, and it is an ivy that grows in a column upwards. Very, very cool. Much, much slower than the standard kind of vining English ivy. That one was cool. I did have that for a bit, basically. Coming on to the humble pothos, so the Premnum aureum. Anybody who has grown a pothos in the house can probably imagine and understand how this plant could end up becoming invasive. If I'm not mistaken, I think its native habitat was the Solomon Islands. And I think, having seen some pictures of how it's been growing around there, if I'm not mistaken, I did manage to find some pictures of it growing naturally in the Solomon Islands. It is a weed, it really, and I don't think any of this will be surprising to anybody, considering that pothos is the quintessential poster child of a plant where you can put it anywhere, it will still do okay. So you can imagine that if it had even the smallest bit of favorable conditions, that you just wouldn't be able to stop it from doing what it does, basically. Now, in terms of it officially being invasive, I think, based on what I was finding in the tropical and subtropical bits of Australia, I think this plant has escaped out a bit more into kind of nature, and it is being considered as a bit more invasive. I mean, this plant can do damage. You might not see it with your humble pothos that you might have in the house, but and I don't know whether I'm going to be able to find any pictures, and I will add it here as well. I kept, throughout all my videos, I keep mentioning one video that I saw ages ago, and I think it's on YouTube. And it is somewhere in the Far East, somebody had put a pothos plant down in the garden section of their building block. The pothos then attached to the building and then started climbing up, because obviously the conditions kind of where it was growing was ideal for it. Huge leaves, getting fenestrations and all of these things, but at some point they needed to remove this plant off the building for whatever reason. It might have been causing issues, structuring and all that stuff, but when they started, barring the fact that it took a lot of effort to get this plant off those outside walls of that building, it took chunks of the building off as it was coming off. So barring the fact that it's a tenacious grower, it can propagate quite easily. It can drown out native species because of its rate of growth and because of how quickly it will cover things. It can also cause structural damage. Same thing goes for, and this wasn't a plant that I was planning on talking about here, but Monstera deliciosa in certain sections of the world can be the same. I remember a very vivid story that a friend of mine had shared where they went to his grandmother's house, and this was in South Africa, and they had planted a Monstera deliciosa outside the front porch kind of area of their house. And I think he was saying his grandmother had passed away and they were trying to clear the house so they could then sell the house, and trying to remove this Monstera deliciosa from that porch area caused a lot of structural damage because it just grew really, really happily. Granted, with the Monstera, it might be a bit slower, so it might not be classed as an invasive species quite so much, but Another one that came up during my research, which surprised me, was the Aglionemas, so the Chinese evergreens. And the reason why I say it surprised me is because, and this might be something that any viewers that I have that are based in kind of tropical regions of the Far East might be able to kind of give a bit more insight on this, because the tropical regions of the Far East is where this plant, if I'm not mistaken, is considered invasive. How? Because anybody that has tried to grow a plant here, like an Aglaonema, it likes relatively low light conditions generally. But I wouldn't ever say that most Aglaonemas, and granted, I've only really had experiences with the really ornate leaved ones or the colourful ones, possibly the slightly more greener varieties, they're not particularly fast. How are these plants? And they don't multiply that easily either. So this one stumped me as well. And the reason why I'm still putting it in here is because I do want to know from people that might be from that region, is this true? Do you see like Aglaonema really kind of like spreading quite a bit? And it might just be the reason why this is surprising me is because in the house we will very rarely ever have these conditions, basically. So do let me know down below in the comments. Very curious to know. I'll wrap up the list of the plants that could be considered a weed or invasive with one that most people probably wouldn't be surprised to know, especially if they've ever grown it. So the Tradescantia. I'm not going to say the common name, which is quite offensive, basically, but it's wandering something, basically. And the wandering part is the thing that we really need to focus on this, because you can imagine if you've ever grown Tradescantia, grows vigorously. Each one of the nodes as well has little root-like structures. And if you'd imagine this growing along kind of the ground, this would root out quite happily in different sections and grow even more vigorously and basically blanket things out entirely. So this would make sense that this plant might be considered invasive in a lot of places around the world. So think kind of Australia, New Zealand. I would imagine it can get quite invasive in certain sections of Africa as well, South Africa. These are plants, I would imagine this would probably be invasive in Greece as well. It is, and I'll give you an example of the tenacity of this plant, and I'll see if I can find a picture and add it here. So I had the pinky, white, and purple variegated version of a Tradescantia. Oh, the Nanook. The Nanook. And I'll see if I can add a picture here. And at some point, I don't know why, but I thought I chopped it off entirely. There was a tiniest bit of stem, obviously, that remained somewhere on a pot that had no soil or any other growing media. And I chucked it into my greenhouse over just before last winter, basically. And we did go down to some minus temperatures last winter. This plant obviously managed to grow a bit. It's a highly variegated plant as well, so not as efficient as it would have been if it was fully green, for instance. And hopefully the picture might be showing you its location, how much has grown in nothing. Just air and a tiny bit of humidity in there. Even in the freezing cold over the winter, this thing survived in the UK. So you can imagine these are tenacious growers, and they could be considered thugs in an environment where there aren't natural predators to control the numbers down, basically. So things to really consider when you think about these things. One of the big things for me would be, it doesn't matter what plant you are getting. Be very, very sure and do your research. It doesn't matter, especially if you're living in parts of the world that are tropical or subtropical and you're looking at tropical houseplants and you want to put them out in the garden. Do your research. Do your research to find out if it's illegal, if there's a legal ramification, because it might already be considered an invasive species where you live. But also do your research past that. Even if there isn't anything legally blocking you from putting this plant outside, really, really, truly consider. So if you're growing a plant that even in its natural habitat is slow growing, it's never going to run away from you, basically. However, if you're growing something like a pothos, for instance, or the Tradescantia that we were talking about, and your conditions are the same outside as it would be in its natural habitat, where you do not have any natural predators to cut down this plant, do consider not putting it in the garden. Same thing would go, and again, I can talk a bit more about the ivy thing here. And I think I remember seeing a video years ago, there's certain plants that you never really want to put into your garden because it's not just going to be you that's going to be dealing with that plant. It's going to be whoever purchases it after you, and whoever purchases it after them, and whoever purchases it after them, barring the fact that it could also encroach into natural habitats as well, not just your garden. So be very, very sure about what you're doing. If there is even the sliver of a doubt, one thing that I might suggest you consider doing is putting the house plant still in a pot outside. And I will even go a step further, because some of these have got substantial roots, is make sure that there's a plant, there is drainage holes in your pot, but it sits on a drip tray. Because then that way it means that even if a root escapes down through the drainage holes of the pot, it will only ever hit the drip tray and not go straight down into the soil, basically. So that's if you want to be extra duper sure that that is not going to cause any real issues. But the reality is, if there's even a shadow of a doubt that you think that that one plant that you might just take out and forget could become invasive, I would just say don't. Just keep it in the house, basically. These are house plants. They're fine and safe in household conditions. But yeah, you can understand why some of these houseplants that we truly love and have loved for years might be weeds or invasive species in their natural environments, because they're tenacious. They grow super fast. They propagate really easily. Not a lot of things that you do will ever really stop it. I mean, look at my Tradescantia Nanook that grew in the freezing cold in a greenhouse in the UK without any soil, and it's still kind of almost thriving at this point. It's absolutely ridiculous. But kind of closing off the video, even if some of our house plants are considered weeds, possibly they have the potential to be invasive if you take them outside in the wild or in nature. This is why we love them. They're tenacious. They just want to keep on keeping on, and they will keep growing even in really, really bad conditions. And I think that's why a lot of people love them, because they are the way that they are, and they will be tenacious. Do I think that at any point in the future we're going to be growing something like stinging nettle in the household? Probably not. Let's be real. But let me paint a different picture for you. If the stinging nettle didn't sting and it had some interesting foliage and maybe some interesting blooms, and a lot of people do use something like stinging nettle for teas and tinctures and all these things, and apparently there's health benefits as well about drinking or consuming nettle as well. I haven't, so I don't know. Would that change your mind? Would that maybe become a houseplant? Because it doesn't have all the negative things that you consider about it, and it's a tenacious grower and all of the above. So it is one of those things. It's sometimes just shifting your mindset slightly to what you might consider a weed actually probably has a bit of value out in nature as well. But yeah, I think I have prattled on for far too long. Hopefully you found this as an interesting topic. Do share your opinions, thoughts. If you know any other weeds or invasive plants that are technically houseplants, down below. And yeah, hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.